All right, welcome back, people of the internet. I'm Professor Seth Monahan, the guy who makes all these theory videos, and you are the lucky folks about to learn a whole lot about combining triads and figured bass. Now, we spent our last two videos learning about Roman numerals and figured bass as separate entities. One that builds chords by stacking the notes of a scale above some root, and then maybe inverting it, and one that builds chords just with intervals above a bass. But as you may know already, these two systems are often used together as an analytical tool. More specifically, you may have seen figured bass placed after a Roman numeral to indicate the inversion of a chord, as I've shown here. And all things considered, combining the two systems is pretty easy to learn if you already know how they work on their own. But it might be worth taking a second to ask why this works at all. Think about it. Figured bass was invented in Italy in the late 1500s, and that's 150 years before the French came up with the idea of chord inversion. So how do these two perspectives mesh so well together? Well, it works because the two systems share a single key feature. Just like figured bass, the principle of triad inversion doesn't care how we distribute our upper voices. In other words, both systems tell us which notes need to appear above some bass note, but only that those notes need to appear somewhere, not specifically where, or in what order, or even how many voices we should use. Let's make this clear with a concrete example. Here are two E natural basses in a 1-sharp key signature. Let's say on the left, I tell you to build me a C major triad in first inversion. And on the right, I say, build me a 6/3 chord. If you know what you're doing, you'd carry out these instructions in exactly the same way. For both of them, we know two things. First, that E natural will be the bass note. And second, that the upper voices will have some combination of C, G, and maybe E, as long as all three notes are present somewhere in the chord above that bass. So we could build the chord in closed position, like this. We could add a few doublings. We could add a lot of doublings, making for a giant 7-note chord. Or we could space the chord very widely, with the upper voices much more than an octave above the bass. I sort of like that one the best. The point, though, is that these are all equally correct solutions to the two little tasks I gave you here. And all this is what allows us to use figured bass as a shorthand for chord inversion. So let's try this out with some triads. And we'll do 7th chords in the next video. Here are the 3 triad inversions we learned in video 5. These are all E major chords. Now, a root position chord, and I don't mean this particular 3-voiced closed position triad, but any root position chord in any voicing will have a figured bass of 5/3. It'll always be the case. And this works in reverse too. When an 18th century musician of Bach's time built what they called a 5/3 chord, they were without fail making what we would call a root position triad. So they're basically the same thing. This works with inverted triads too. Any first inversion triad will correspond to the figures 6/3, just like the figures 6/3 will produce what we call a first inversion triad. And then to wrap it up, any second inversion triad will automatically produce the figures 6/4 and vice versa. So if I write 6/4, the Baroque keyboardist is going to play what we call a second inversion triad. Now, in video 6, we learned about the standard abbreviations for these bass figures as well, and those same abbreviations apply here. So if we mean to indicate a 5/3 chord, that's to say a root position chord, no figures are required. We just put a Roman numeral by itself. But if we want to indicate a first inversion chord, we do need figures. Specifically, we'd use the integer 6, which, as we learned in the last video, is the standard abbreviation for 6/3. And as we also learned in that video, there is no abbreviation for 6/4. So when we want a second inversion triad, we have to write out the complete unabbreviated set of figures. Now let's try all this out. Imagine we're in E major here, and even though we don't have the right key signature. To analyze the first chord, the one that's in root position, we'd simply use the Roman numeral 1, uppercase with no figures. Remember, the uppercase means major. By contrast, the second chord would be called a 1/6 chord, telling us that it has the notes of the tonic triad with the chordal third, G sharp, in the bass. And then finally, the last chord would be analyzed as 1/6/4, telling us that we've got the notes of the tonic triad, but now with the chordal fifth, B natural, in the bass. Now, there's a point I'm going to make a lot in the videos ahead, and I'm going to start making it now too. And that's this. Just because the various inversions of a triad have the same notes does not mean that they're all equivalent or interchangeable. In fact, the opposite is true. And the main reason is that some inversions are thought to be more stable and more acoustically consonant than others. Let's take a second to go over this. In the context of the classical style, major and minor triads are considered to be the most stable when they're in root position. That is to say, to an experienced listener, a root position chord will tend to sound more grounded, less itchy to resolve into some other harmony than an inverted one. Now, by contrast, when a major or minor triad is in second inversion, it's usually regarded as highly unstable and thus more likely to sound like it wants to move or to resolve to some other chord. And first inversion triads are thought to lie somewhere in between, not as stable as root position, but not as itchy to move as a second inversion. Now, rather than going on a long technical explanation of why these inversions are more or less stable, I'll just give you a few quick examples at the keyboard. Let's say that we're in the key of E major. That makes all of these E major triads 1 chords. Now, people will often say that the tonic chord is the most stable chord in a key. It's our home base, they would say, the place we ultimately come to rest. But when they say this, they're really referring to the root position tonic triad, which is indeed the most stable sounding chord in a key, and the place where it comes to a rest, which is to say, it'll usually be the last chord we hear in a piece in that key. Now compare this to the 6/4 version of the same chord. Classical composers did not hear this as a stable chord or as a point of rest at all. Same notes, but the inversions create a totally different effect. If you know the classical style, you'll recognize this as a chord that wants to move. It feels like it wants to topple over, and it almost always does, bringing us to stabler ground, like this. So for this reason, as we'll see, 6/4 chords tend to require very special, careful treatment in the classical style, especially compared to their root position siblings. But we've gotten a bit off track here. The point, the bigger point, is that combining figured bass and Roman numerals works. And from at least one perspective, they're perfectly complementary. Think about what these symbols tell us. Roman numerals give us the root of a triad, but not the inversion. And figured bass does exactly the opposite. It gives us the inversion, but not the root. Put them together, and they tell us everything we need to know about a chord as long as we know what key we're in. Let's do an example here. Let's say we're in B minor, and someone says, hey, give me a 3 chord. Well, that could be any of 3 inversions of the 3 chord. Same goofball says, hey, give me a 6/3 chord. Well, that could be any of 7 triads. But put them together, and now we know everything we need to know. We know exactly which notes are in the chord. The Roman numeral tells us that it's going to be D, F sharp, and A. And then the figured bass tells us which note is in the bass. It's going to be F sharp or the chordal third. Now, there's one other thing to notice about combining these two systems. You'll remember from video 6 that when we wanted to apply accidentals to some note in a chord, we used special alteration symbols in the figured bass, a plus sign, a slash, etc. When we combine Roman numerals and figured bass, though, we usually omit these symbols because the case of the Roman numeral, that's to say whether it's in uppercase or lowercase, the case of the Roman numeral will tell us the chord quality, and then we just apply accidentals accordingly. So let's take an example, and let's stick with the key of B minor. Here is a second inversion minor dominant chord in B minor. You'll remember that this is the dominant that uses the notes of the natural minor scale. Its root is F sharp, and its chordal fifth is in the bass. Now, historically, the figured bass alone for this chord would just be 6/4. And the Roman numeral would be a lowercase 5 to show that it's a minor triad. Now let's compare that to the far more common chord, the major dominant, again shown in second inversion. So it's this chord. The root is still F sharp, chordal fifth is in the bass, but this is the chord that uses the raised leading tone A sharp from the harmonic and melodic minor scales. Now 300 years ago, the standalone figured bass for this chord would be a 6/4 with a slash through the sixth, telling the performer that the A, which is a sixth above the bass, needs to be sharpened. And the Roman numeral would be different too. Now we'd use an uppercase 5 to show that we're dealing with a major triad. Now let's look at how we combine the two systems now. For the chord on the left, we just put the two symbols next to each other, as is. We have a lowercase 5 and the integers 6/4. But for the chord on the right, the one with the A sharp, most analysts would simply use the uppercase 5 with the integers 6/4, but omitting the slash. And they do this because the case of the Roman numeral, the fact that it's uppercase, telling us it's a major triad, already conveys that information. The uppercase Roman numeral says, make a major triad on scale degree 5. And to do that, we'd have to use the A sharp. To use the A would give us a minor triad. Now, that's not to say that there's anything wrong with using the slash. Some really fastidious analysts do actually include it, and in that case you have two signals, one from the figured base, one from the Roman numeral, telling you to sharpen A. And which, when you think about it, is probably a good thing. But that's not typically how it's done, and it won't be how I do it in the videos ahead. Now, I'd like to wrap up by stressing a really important point, and one that students tend to forget. Here in this video, we've always used figured base to indicate what are called chord tones. In other words, each integer in the figure base corresponds to one of the notes implied by the Roman numeral that we paired it with. But as I stressed in video 7, figured base can account for any combination of notes. You might recall that I used figures to create a very strange harmony that sounded like this, to bring that point home. Well, because of this, because figure base can account for any combination of notes, it can also be used to show what we call non-chord tones. That is, melodic notes that embellish some underlying chord. Think of the old-fashioned embellishment where you take a triad and you do a little melodic turn around the chordal third. In a later video, we'll learn the more advanced technique of using figured base to show exactly that kind of thing. But for now, our next task is to learn all about seventh chords in video number 8. So thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next time around.